The tomatoes were doing well this year. James Keller crouched in his small backyard garden, checking the vines with the kind of careful attention that came from having too much time and too little purpose. The Oregon coast was mild in September, fog rolling in from the ocean every morning and burning off by noon, leaving the air salted and clean. He'd lived here for 5 years under the name David Chen, and in that time he'd learned 17 different ways to avoid thinking about the past. The shop had been slow today. Only 2 jobs, a tourist shuttle with a faulty navigation array and a local's atmospheric skiff that needed new compression seals. Easy work, mindless work. The kind that let his hands stay busy while his brain went quiet, which was exactly what he needed. He'd become good at quiet, good at routine, good at being someone unremarkable in an unremarkable town where nobody asked questions about the scars on his back or why he always checked the sky before going inside. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called over the fence, asking about her grandson's model rocket that kept losing altitude. James gave her some advice about fuel mixture and weight distribution, the kind of basic aerospace engineering that a mechanic might reasonably know. Nothing that would suggest he'd once piloted combat fighters through hostile space at velocities that would liquefy an unprotected human body. She thanked him and went back inside, and James returned to his tomatoes. The sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples that didn't exist in space, and James was thinking about dinner, something simple, maybe pasta, when the pressure changed. Not weather pressure, something else. Something old and military in his nervous system recognized it before his conscious mind caught up. Spatial distortion, the kind that happened when something very large was manipulating spacetime in ways spacetime didn't particularly appreciate. He stood slowly, dirt on his hands, and looked up. The sky was normal, no ships, no visible distortions. But the feeling intensified, a thrumming in his bones that said incoming, said threat, said run you idiot, run now. Except there was nowhere to run, and he'd known, somewhere deep in the part of himself he'd tried to bury, that this day would eventually come. The air 10 feet in front of him tore. Not cracked, not shimmered, tore, like fabric ripping along an invisible seam. Reality peeled back, and through the wound stepped a woman who shouldn't exist on this planet. In this garden, in this carefully constructed life he'd built from lies and distance. Empress Zarieth Velkaron stood in his tomato patch, wearing battle armor that looked like someone had forged starlight into metal. Every plate and edge designed for function and terror in equal measure. Her silver hair defied Earth's gravity, moving in a wind that didn't exist, and her eyes, those impossible silver eyes with their geometric patterns, locked onto him with the precision of a targeting computer. James forgot how to breathe. 5 years collapsed into nothing. 3 months of captivity, of conversation, of connection he'd convinced himself was survival instinct and Stockholm syndrome, came flooding back so hard he actually took a step backward before catching himself. "Hello, James," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it. Cold as deep space, precise as mathematics, carrying authority that made you want to kneel even if you'd never knelt to anyone in your life. "Did you truly believe I wouldn't find you?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Zarieth tilted her head, studying him the way she used to during their conversations, like he was a puzzle she was determined to solve through pure analytical force. "You look well," she continued, stepping forward. Her boot crushed a tomato plant she didn't notice. "Civilian life suits you. The beard is new. I disapprove, but I'll allow it for now." James finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "You can't be here. And yet," she gestured at herself, at the impossible fact of her presence, "here I am, violating Earth sovereignty, risking interstellar incident, causing my security detail significant distress as I left them in orbit without explanation." She paused. "You've been difficult to locate, James Keller, or should I say David Chen." The false identity was competent. The altered records, the cash transactions, the avoidance of major transit hubs, all very professional. I'm almost impressed. How did you find you? She smiled, and it wasn't kind. I am Empress of the Velkaron Empire. I command resources that would make your Earth Council weep with envy. I have intelligence networks spanning 3 galaxies. And I've spent the last 4 years, 7 months, and 16 days tracking your movements across this backwater system. She took another step closer. Did you think I'd forget you? Did you honestly believe you were so inconsequential that I'd simply move on? The question hit harder than it should have, because yes, that's exactly what he'd believed. That he'd been a temporary curiosity, a human specimen she'd kept around for entertainment and tactical information, and that once he'd escaped she'd shrug and return to conquering systems and crushing rebellions, and doing all the things empresses did when they weren't interrogating prisoners. I was your captive, he said, forcing steel into his voice. I escaped. That's what soldiers do. Captive. Zarieth repeated the word like it tasted wrong. Is that truly how you remember it? Because I recall giving you quarters near my own. I recall unrestricted access to our archives. I recall conversations that lasted until the ship's dawn cycle, discussions of philosophy and strategy, and the peculiar human tendency towards self-destructive idealism. Her voice dropped, went quieter, which somehow made it more dangerous. I recall you looking at me like I was a person instead of a weapon. Tell me, James, did your other captors do the same? He had no answer to that. Because she was right and they both knew it. The 3 months he'd spent aboard her flagship hadn't been traditional imprisonment. He'd been kept, yes, but not in chains. Monitored but not tortured. Questioned but not broken. And somewhere in those long conversations across the table in her private quarters, something had shifted. He'd started seeing past the crown and the conquest to the person underneath. Brilliant, lonely, convinced that emotion was weakness and connection was liability. And she'd started asking him questions that had nothing to do with military intelligence. About Earth. About humanity. About what it felt like to believe in democracy and chaos, and the insane notion that people could govern themselves without an autocrat to impose order. He'd answered honestly because lying to her was pointless, and because some part of him had wanted her to understand, had wanted to crack that perfect ice exterior, and find the person he suspected was trapped beneath it. You're right, he admitted. You weren't like other captors, but you're still a conqueror. You still rule an empire built on subjugation, and I couldn't. He stopped, struggled with words. I couldn't stay there, couldn't be part of that. So when the opportunity came, I took it. Without a word, without explanation, you vanished during a security malfunction and left me to wonder if you'd been killed in the chaos. Something flashed in her eyes, quickly suppressed. It took me 6 hours to confirm you'd stolen a scout ship, another 3 days to accept you weren't coming back. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. But I'm not sorry I left. Zarieth went very still, and James recognized that stillness from his time aboard her ship. It was what she did before making decisions that would affect millions of lives, a moment of absolute focus before action. Come back with me, she said finally. No, that wasn't a request, I know. James met her eyes, forced himself not to flinch from what he saw there. But I'm still saying no. I've built a life here, I have work, friends, peace. I'm not giving that up to be your pet human again. Pet. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Is that what you think you were? A curiosity, an amusement? She laughed, and it was cold and bitter and hurt in ways he didn't want to examine. You really understood nothing. She closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and suddenly she was there, close enough that he could see the slight glow her armor gave off, close enough that her presence seemed to fill his small backyard like weather. Let me be clear, James Keller. You were never a pet. You were never a prisoner. You were the only person in my entire empire who looked at me and saw someone worth talking to instead of someone to fear or manipulate or overthrow. Her voice went quieter, more dangerous. You changed me, made me question things I'd accepted without thought for 30 years, made me wonder if conquest was really strength or just elaborate compensation for being unable to connect with anything real. Zarieth, I'm not finished. She reached up and her hand, elegant and deadly and capable of signing orders that would end civilizations, touched his face with unexpected gentleness. You left, and I told myself it was better. Simpler, I returned to my duties and pretended nothing had changed. But it had. I found myself hesitating before military actions, questioning casualty reports, offering negotiations when I would have simply crushed resistance. My advisors thought I'd gone soft, my generals considered coup, and all I could think was that somewhere, a human pilot was living free and probably relieved to be away from me. James's heart was doing complicated things. You came all this way to tell me I ruined your ability to be a tyrant. I came because I refused to surrender what's mine. Her thumb brushed his cheek. And you, James Keller, are mine in ways that have nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the fact that I cannot function properly without you. So you will return with me or I will stay here until you do, consequences be damned. That's not how this works. You can't just, I can, I have, and I will. She smiled, sharp and certain. I've cleared 3 months from my schedule. My second in command has standing orders. I'm prepared to wait. James stared at her, at this impossible woman who'd torn through space to find him, who was threatening him with companionship, who apparently didn't understand that you couldn't force someone to care about you. Except looking into those silver eyes, he wondered if maybe she understood perfectly and was gambling that he already did. Come inside, he said finally. We should probably talk about this without the neighbors calling the police about the armed alien in my garden. Zarieth glanced around, seeming to notice her surroundings for the first time. You have neighbors, how quaint. They're called people. They live near other people. It's very popular on Earth. Your species has always mystified me. But she followed him toward the house, and James tried very hard not to think about what it meant that she was here, that she'd found him, that some part of him was singing at her presence, even as the rest of him screamed that this was dangerous and complicated and would end badly. He opened his back door and gestured her inside. Zarieth stepped over the threshold into his small, ordinary house, and James Keller closed the door on his quiet life and whatever came next. Zarieth examined his kitchen with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for conquered territories requiring pacification strategies. She'd removed her helmet, and her hair, that impossible silver cascade that moved like it was underwater, caught the overhead light and threw it back in patterns that made his cheap fixtures look inadequate. Her armor gleamed against his worn countertops, a ship of war docked at a civilian port. This is where you've been living, she said, not quite a question. This small structure with its primitive heating system and its inefficient food storage. She opened his refrigerator, peered inside. You're subsisting on fermented dairy products and processed vegetation. James, this is beneath you. It's called groceries. Most people have them. He filled his kettle, set it on the stove, pulled down 2 mugs. And before you critique my lifestyle choices, remember that you're the one who showed up uninvited. I don't require invitations. I'm an empress. You're in Oregon. Different rules apply. The kettle started heating, and James busied himself with tea preparation because his hands needed something to do besides shake. How did you even get here? There are protocols. Earth's defensive grid should have detected a Velkaron ship before it entered the solar system. It did. I disabled the alerts. She said this casually, like she was discussing weather. Your grid is adequate for deterring pirates and monitoring commercial traffic, but against Velkaron stealth technology, it's decorative at best. I could have parked a battle fleet in your moon's shadow, and your council wouldn't have noticed for 3 days. That's deeply concerning from a planetary security standpoint. Yes, well, I'll send your military a detailed report on their vulnerabilities after we've resolved this situation. Zarieth pulled out a chair, sat with the kind of precise grace that suggested she'd been trained in movement the way others were trained in combat. You haven't asked the relevant question yet. James poured hot water over tea bags chamomile because he needed calm and she probably needed it more. Which question is that? Why I came alone? Why I didn't simply send a retrieval team to collect you? Why I risked personal exposure and diplomatic incident when I could have delegated this task to subordinates? She accepted the mug he offered, examined it like it might contain tactical intelligence. Aren't you curious? I assumed you wanted to yell at me personally. I could have yelled via communication array, more efficient, better encryption. She sipped the tea, her expression flickering through surprise and something that might have been approval. This is not terrible. Again, high praise from the conqueror of worlds. James sat across from her, maintaining the table as neutral territory. So why did you come personally? Zarieth was quiet for a moment, staring into her mug like it held answers. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. Because delegating this felt wrong. Because the thought of someone else finding you, talking to you, possibly frightening you, she stopped. Because this matters, you matter, and I don't delegate things that matter. The admission hung between them like live ordnance. James wrapped his hands around his own mug, using the heat to ground himself. You spent 5 years tracking me down because I matter. 4 years, 7 months, 16 days. I've been precise about this. She looked up, met his eyes. And yes, despite the enormous inconvenience, despite the diplomatic complications, despite my advisors staging an intervention about my unhealthy fixation on a single human when there are billions more available. Her fingers tightened on the mug. You're not replaceable, James. I tried. I assigned my best analysts to find someone similar, another human with your particular combination of tactical insight and philosophical obstinance, an infuriating ability to make me question myself. Do you know what they found? What? 700,000 potential candidates. I interviewed 43 personally. None of them were you. She set down the mug with careful control. None of them looked at me like I was a person worth knowing instead of a threat to be managed. None of them argued with me about governance philosophy at 3 in the morning. None of them made me laugh. James blinked. I made you laugh. Twice. Both times you seemed surprised I was capable of it. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across her face. You told me about Earth's chaotic political system, where leaders are chosen by popular vote and half the population disagrees with every decision. I said it sounded inefficient. You said yes, but it was their inefficiency, chosen freely, and that made it better than perfect order imposed from above. I laughed because the idea was absurd. And then I spent the next 6 months restructuring our colonial administration to allow more local autonomy. You did what? You heard me. 14 systems now have local governance councils. My generals hate it. My advisors predicted disaster. And yet somehow it's working better than direct imperial control because it turns out people fight harder to preserve something they chose than something forced upon them. She met his eyes. Your fault. Entirely your fault. James tried to process this. You're telling me you reformed imperial policy because of conversations we had. I'm telling you that you infected me with doubt, with conscience, with the terrible burden of actually caring about whether my actions cause unnecessary suffering. Her voice rose slightly, actual emotion bleeding through. I was efficient before you, ruthless, clear about objectives and unbothered by moral complexities. And then they're profoundly unreasonable questions when you're trying to maintain an empire. She stood abruptly, began pacing. But I couldn't ignore them, couldn't dismiss them, because you asked them without malice or fear, just genuine curiosity about why I'd built my life around principles I'd never examined. And once you asked, I couldn't stop examining them myself. James watched her pace his small kitchen, this woman who commanded fleets and conquered worlds, agitated by philosophy in ways combat never seemed to make her. So you came here because I ruined your ability to be a tyrant and you're angry about it. I came here because hating you was easier than admitting the truth. She stopped, turned to face him. That you didn't ruin me. You reminded me I was alive. That beneath the genetic optimization and the strategic training and the crown, I'm still a person. And persons need, she struggled, searching for words. I don't have a term for it in our language. Connection, understanding, someone who sees you completely and doesn't flinch away. I ran halfway across the galaxy. But you're still here, still sitting with me, still listening instead of calling for security or whatever primitive enforcement you have on this world. She moved closer, and James's kitchen had never felt smaller. You flinched from the Empire, from what I represented, but not from me. Never from me, even at the end. You looked at me the night before you escaped, and I saw something in your eyes that terrified me more than any military threat ever has. What did you see? Regret. Her voice went quiet. You didn't want to leave. You felt you had to. And I couldn't give you a reason to stay that didn't sound like imprisonment with better decor. James stood because sitting felt like surrender. You could have said something. Could have asked me to stay as a person instead of as an empress giving orders. I didn't know how. I still don't, really. I was raised to command, not to ask. She was close enough now that he could see the faint luminescence in her eyes, the patterns that shifted like circuit diagrams. But I'm trying now, I'm asking now. Come back with me, not as a prisoner, not as a subject, as she hesitated. As whatever you're willing to be, advisor, companion, friend. I'll accept any title that keeps you near. And if I say no? Pain flashed across her face, quickly suppressed. Then I honor that choice and leave. And I don't come back. And I spend the rest of my reign wondering if there were words I should have found, arguments I should have made, ways I could have convinced you that this, she gestured between them, was worth the complications. James looked at her, really looked at her the way he used to on her flagship during those long nights of conversation. Silver eyes that held calculations and loneliness in equal measure. Features that were almost human but just different enough to be alien, to be other, to remind him she came from a species that had been optimized for rule across 11 generations. And beneath all that armor and authority, the same person who'd once admitted she didn't understand why humans wrote poetry but wanted to learn because he'd quoted some, and she'd found it interesting. You scare me, he said quietly. I know, I scare most people. Not because of your power, because of what I felt when I was with you, because part of me didn't want to leave, and that part terrified me more than anything you could actually do to me. He took a breath. I convinced myself it was Stockholm Syndrome, survival instinct, some kind of psychological adaptation to captivity. Spent 5 years telling myself that what we had wasn't real. And now you're standing in my kitchen at midnight, telling me you restructured imperial policy because I asked annoying questions, and I'm realizing I might have been lying to myself. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what this is, what we are, but I know that when you showed up in my garden, the first thing I felt wasn't fear, it was relief, and I don't know what to do with that. Zarieth went very still. What do you need to know? To decide what would help? Time, space to think without you filling my kitchen with imperial presence and logical arguments. How much time? Ask me in the morning. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Acceptable. I can be patient, I've waited this long. She glanced around. Though I assume you don't have quarters suitable for an empress. I have a couch. A couch. She said it like he'd offered her a sleeping bag in a swamp. How do you survive like this? Most humans manage just fine with couches. Your species' threshold for discomfort never ceases to amaze me. But she was almost smiling. Very well. Show me this couch, and I'll endure it in the spirit of cultural exchange. James showed her to the living room, pulled out spare blankets that seemed inadequate against her armor, and tried not to think about the fact that the most powerful woman in 3 galaxies was going to sleep on his second-hand furniture. Zarieth removed some of her armor, not all, never all, because even here she was prepared for threats, and examined the couch like it was a particularly challenging military obstacle. This is very small, she observed. It's a standard couch. Human standards continue to disappoint. But she sat, arranged herself with that same precise grace. James, before you go, thank you. For what? For not calling security, for making tea, for listening even though I arrived uninvited and crushed your vegetables. She looked up at him, and in the dim light her eyes seemed softer, less like targeting computers, and more like something almost vulnerable. For still being alive, I had contingencies in place if I discovered you died during your escape. None of them were pleasant. James didn't want to think about what unpleasant contingencies meant coming from someone who could glass planets. Get some sleep, we'll talk in the morning. I don't sleep much, genetic optimization. Then rest, or meditate, or do whatever empresses do when they're trying not to think too hard. He went to his room, closed the door, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while his brain tried to process the impossible situation he'd found himself in. Zarieth was here, in his house, on his couch. After crossing the galaxy to find him because apparently he'd accidentally reformed an empire by asking too many questions about ethics and governance. And the worst part, the absolutely terrifying part, was that he was glad she was here. Glad she'd found him. Glad that she'd cared enough to spend 5 years tracking him down instead of moving on to easier conquests. He didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m. he gave up, pulled on clothes, and went to check on her. She was standing at his window, still in partial armor, staring out at the ocean with an expression he couldn't read. "Do your people have oceans?" he asked. 17 of our worlds have significant water coverage. But I haven't visited one in 12 years. Empresses don't vacation. Sounds lonely. Efficient, she corrected, but there was something in her voice that agreed with him. James moved to stand beside her, keeping careful distance. They stood in silence for a while, watching darkness and distant lights. Finally, Zarieth spoke. "What are you thinking? That this is insane, that you being here violates about 17 treaties. That my quiet life just exploded and I should be furious about it." He paused. "And that I missed you, which is possibly the most inconvenient thing I've ever felt." Zarieth turned to look at him, and something in her expression cracked, just slightly. "Inconvenient barely covers it, but I'll take it." They stayed there until dawn, two people from different worlds standing in a small house on Earth's coast, not touching but not quite separate either, while above them her ship waited in silent orbit, and below them an ocean rolled in rhythms older than empires. And somewhere in that pre-dawn darkness, James Keller started to think that maybe running had solved exactly nothing, and that some pursuits were worth being caught. Morning came with fog rolling in from the ocean, turning the world soft and gray. James made coffee because his brain couldn't function without it, and watched Zarieth examine his coffee maker like it was alien technology requiring careful analysis. She'd put her armor back on at some point, full battle configuration, which seemed excessive for breakfast, but he wasn't going to comment. "This device heats water and forces it through compressed plant matter," she observed. "Inefficient but apparently culturally significant. It's coffee, humans run on it. Your species runs on many inadvisable things. Coffee, democracy, the belief that individual freedom outweighs collective security." She accepted the cup he offered, took a cautious sip. Her face did something complicated. "This is bitter." "Yeah, that's the point. Why would you intentionally consume bitter substances? Why would you conquer 17 star systems when you already had 16? Zarieth's lips twitched. "Point taken." She took another sip, grimaced slightly, continued drinking anyway. "I've been thinking about your request. For time to decide. It's been 6 hours. Yes, well, I'm not patient by nature, but I'm trying." She set down the cup. "I should tell you what returning with me would actually entail, so you can make an informed decision instead of operating on incomplete data." James leaned against his counter, cradling his own coffee. "All right, tell me. First, the political reality. My court will be hostile. You're human, from a species they consider barely civilized. You have no title, no genetic optimization, no official standing. The moment I bring you back, they'll see you as proof their empress has been compromised by alien influence." She said this matter-of-factly, like she was describing weather patterns. "There will be assassination attempts. How many? If you survive the first month, 3, maybe 4. After that they'll realize I take threats to you personally and the attempts will stop. Probably. You're really selling this. I'm being honest. You wanted truth, I'm giving it." She started pacing, that restless energy again. "Second, the practical concerns. You'd live on my flagship. Private quarters adjacent to mine. Full access to archives, recreational facilities, anything you need. You'd have a security detail whether you want one or not, non-negotiable after the assassination attempts. And you'd be expected to attend certain functions, represent my interests at diplomatic events, generally be visible enough that people understand you're not a prisoner." "What would my actual role be?" Zarieth stopped pacing, turned to face him. "Whatever you want it to be. Advisor if you want to shape policy. Scholar if you prefer research. Companion if you just want to argue with me about philosophy at 3 in the morning." She paused. "There's no precedent for this. The Velkaron don't have a term for what I'm proposing. Consort implies marriage, which we don't practice. Advisor implies purely professional relationship, which would be inaccurate. You'd be mine in whatever way you choose to be. That's not ominous at all. I don't do romance well, I do possession, loyalty, protection." She moved closer. "But I'm trying to learn the difference between owning someone and choosing to be with them. You'd have to be patient with me." James set down his coffee before he dropped it. "You're asking me to return to an empire that will try to kill me, live on a warship, and help you figure out how to have a relationship when you've been genetically optimized to rule instead of connect. Am I understanding this correctly?" "Yes, when you phrase it that way it sounds inadvisable. It sounds insane. Also accurate." Zarieth was close now, close enough that her presence seemed to fill his small kitchen. "But consider the alternative. You stay here. Live your quiet life. Repair shuttles, grow vegetables, and every night you wonder what could have been if you'd been brave enough to try. That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair. I'm an empress asking a mechanic to gamble on something that has no guaranteed outcome. But I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is walking away and spending the rest of my reign knowing I didn't fight for this." James looked at her, at this impossible woman who'd crossed galaxies and violated treaties and restructured policy because he'd asked annoying questions about ethics. "I have conditions." Hope flared in her eyes, quickly controlled. "Name them." "First, no more conquest for the sake of conquest. You said you've been questioning military actions. Make that official policy. Negotiate first. War only as last resort." "Agreed." "My generals will resign in protest, but they've been looking for an excuse anyway." "Second, I'm not your possession. Partner, companion, whatever we call it, but not property. The moment you treat me like something owned, I leave." "Accepted without reservation." She said it immediately, which meant something. "What else?" "Third, I visit Earth regularly. I don't cut ties with my homeworld just because I'm living in your empire." "Our empire," she corrected. "If you're returning, it's ours. And yes, you can visit Earth. We'll establish proper diplomatic channels so I'm not committing treaty violations every time we orbit your moon." James realized what he was doing, agreeing to return with her to live on an imperial flagship, to essentially become consort to a galactic empress. It should terrify him. Maybe it did. But it also felt right in a way his quiet life here never quite managed. "One more thing. Yes, you have to try my tomatoes before we go. I worked hard on those." Zarieth blinked, thrown by the shift in tone. Then, impossibly, she laughed. A real laugh, not the cold mockery he'd sometimes heard in court, but something genuine and surprised and almost delighted. "You're negotiating vegetable consumption as a relationship condition. They're really good tomatoes, I'm proud of them. You're absolutely insane. You crossed galaxies to find me. We're both insane." She was smiling now, really smiling, and it transformed her face from beautiful and terrifying to just beautiful. "Is this your answer then? You'll return?" "I'm saying I'll try, really try, not just survive. I'll help you build something better. I'll argue with you and complicate your life and probably drive you crazy." He took a breath. "But yeah, I'll come back. Because running was supposed to make me feel free, and instead I've just been alone." Zarieth closed the distance between them in one step, her hand finding his face with a certainty that suggested she'd been thinking about this for 5 years. "I should warn you, my court will make your life difficult. Constant political maneuvering, tests of your position, attempts to undermine your influence." "Sounds terrible. It will be." She was smiling though, sharp and certain. "But you'll have me, and I'm very effective at dealing with people who threaten what's mine." "I thought I wasn't property." "You're not, but you are mine in every way that matters, and I protect what's mine." James should probably object to the possessiveness, but he was starting to understand that for Zarieth, claiming something wasn't about ownership. It was about commitment. It was how she loved, if she even had words for that concept yet. "When do we leave?" Eager, practical. "If I'm doing this, I'd rather not drag it out. Plus, there's the whole treaty violation thing. The longer you're here, the higher the chance Earth's defense grid figures it out and we have an interstellar incident." Valid concern. Zarieth pulled out a small device, activated it with a gesture. "I'll signal my ship. We can depart within the hour." An hour. James looked around his small house at the life he'd built from lies and distance. "I need to pack, settle some things. Leave a note for Mrs. Patterson about her grandson's rocket. Take what you need. I'll handle the rest." He packed a single bag, clothes, a few books, a photo of his family he kept meaning to contact but never did. Everything else could stay. Let the landlord wonder where David Chen went. Let the neighbors speculate. In a few months this place would be rented to someone else, and his careful, quiet life would be completely erased. Zarieth watched him pack with that same analytical intensity. No regrets. "Ask me in a year." He zipped the bag. "What about my tomatoes? What about them? You promised to try them." She stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head with something that might have been affection. "Very well. Show me these vegetables you're so proud of." They went to the garden together, Zarieth in full battle armor and James in jeans and a jacket, and he picked the ripest tomato he could find. She examined it like it might contain tactical intelligence, then took a careful bite. Her expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, consideration, reluctant approval. "This is acceptable," she admitted. "High praise from the conqueror of worlds. Don't let it go to your head." But she finished the tomato, and James felt absurdly pleased about it. The ship descended at dawn, cloaked but visible to him, because Zarieth wanted him to see it. A sleek predator of a vessel that made his backyard look even smaller by comparison. The boarding ramp extended with silent precision, and Zarieth gestured toward it. "Last chance to change your mind," she said. James looked at his house, at the quiet life he was abandoning, at the woman who'd torn through space itself to find him. "Let's go before I start thinking too hard about this." They walked up the ramp together, and the ship sealed behind them with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The interior was exactly as he remembered: sleek, efficient, slightly too cold, designed for function over comfort. Crew members stopped and stared as Zarieth passed with a human in tow, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed hostility. "Ignore them," Zarieth said quietly. "They'll adjust or transfer. I don't particularly care which." She led him through corridors that hummed with power, past observation decks and strategic centers, to a section near the ship's core. His quarters were adjacent to hers, connected by a private passage, and they were significantly larger than his entire house had been. "This is excessive," he observed. "This is appropriate for someone of your position." She gestured around the space. "Security access is keyed to you. Privacy settings are your choice. If you need anything, ask the ship's AI or find me." I'm usually in the command center or my private quarters. Zarieth. He caught her hand before she could leave. Thank you for coming to find me, for not giving up, for making this possible even though it's complicated and inadvisable and will probably cause you endless political headaches. She turned back, and her expression softened in ways he suspected few people ever saw. James, you made me want to be better than I was, more than what I was designed for. That's worth any number of political headaches. She squeezed his hand once, then released it. Rest. We jump to hyperspace in 2 hours. After that, it's 6 days to the Empire's core. Plenty of time to prepare you for what comes next. She left, and James was alone in quarters that were too large and too quiet and too far from everything he'd known. He should feel trapped, should feel like he'd made a terrible mistake. But standing there in the heart of a Velkaron warship, watching stars through the viewport as they broke orbit and left Earth behind, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt like he'd come home. The diplomatic summit at the Empire's core was exactly as terrible as Zarieth had promised. James stood beside her in a hall that could have held his entire Oregon town, surrounded by representatives from 40 conquered systems, all of them staring at the human who'd somehow convinced their empress to restructure policy and bring him to the literal center of power. Zarieth had prepared him during the 6-day journey, briefed him on political factions, explained which ambassadors were genuine diplomats and which were spies for their resistance movements, taught him the subtle body language that meant respect versus challenge versus threat. He'd absorbed it all while also relearning how to exist in her presence without the weight of captivity, figuring out what it meant to be partner instead of prisoner. They'd spent hours talking, just like before, except now the conversations went deeper. She told him about her childhood, the genetic optimization, the brutal education, the way she'd been shaped into a weapon before she was old enough to understand what that meant. He told her about Earth, about growing up in Detroit with parents who worked too hard and siblings who'd scattered to different cities, about choosing military service because he'd wanted to see the stars and had no idea what that actually meant. And slowly, carefully, they'd built something new. Not romance exactly, neither of them knew how to do that, but partnership, trust, the kind of connection that came from seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway. Now standing in front of the Empire's elite, James understood exactly how much Zarieth had risked bringing him here. The stares weren't just curious. They were hostile, calculating, measuring him for weaknesses. A Crithian ambassador whispered something to her companion and they both laughed, the sound not reaching James's translator but the mockery clear anyway. Zarieth's hand found his, a brief touch that steadied him. "Ignore them," she murmured. "You've survived worse." "Have I, though? You survived me. Everything else is easy by comparison." The summit began with all the formality and pageantry that empires apparently required. Speeches about unity and strength, and the glorious future of Velkaron expansion. James listened and tried not to visibly cringe at the propaganda. Beside him, Zarieth sat perfectly still, her expression giving nothing away, but he'd learned to read her tells. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed once against her armrest when someone said something particularly stupid. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with the kind of presence that made the entire hall fall silent. "Honored delegates, I'm aware you've noticed changes in imperial policy over the past year. More autonomy for colonial governments, reduced military occupation, increased investment in local infrastructure rather than resource extraction." She paused, let them process. "Some of you have questioned these changes, suggested they indicate weakness. Allow me to be clear, they indicate evolution." The hall erupted in whispers. Zarieth waited them out with perfect patience. "Our empire was built on strength," she continued, "on the belief that order must be imposed, that unity requires force. But strength without wisdom is just brutality with better organization. And wisdom requires perspective I did not have, until recently." She gestured toward James, and every eye in the hall locked onto him. He forced himself not to flinch. This is James Keller, human, former military officer, currently my primary advisor on matters of governance and diplomatic strategy. Her voice carried absolute authority. He has no genetic optimization, no formal training in imperial politics. What he has is the ability to ask questions that should have been asked generations ago. Questions like, what if conquest isn't the only path to strength? What if people governed with compassion are more loyal than people governed through fear? What if the empire's future depends not on how much territory we claim, but on whether that territory actually wants to be part of what we're building? The silence was absolute. James could practically hear the political calculations happening across the hall. I am not weak, Zarieth said, and her voice could have cut steel. I am evolving. And this empire will evolve with me, or it will be left behind. She sat down, the conversation clearly over. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic, ambassadors clustering in groups, arguing in whispers. A few approached Zarieth directly, some to pledge support, others to barely disguise their contempt. James stayed beside her, a silent presence, trying to project competence he didn't entirely feel. An older Velkaron woman, Ambassador Krell, one of the conservative faction leaders, stopped in front of them. Her eyes, the same silver as Zarieth's but colder, swept over James with open disdain. Empress, a word. Speak, Krell. This human, this advisor. You cannot seriously expect us to accept policy changes based on the opinions of a species that barely achieved interstellar travel. I expect you to accept policy changes because I've implemented them and I am your empress, Zarieth said calmly. Whether those changes came from James's insight or from divine intervention is irrelevant to your obligation to comply. Krell's expression hardened. This is a mistake, one that will cost us. Mark my words, Zarieth Velkaron, bringing sentiment into governance is how empires fall, and refusing to adapt is how they stagnate and die. Zarieth stood, using her height advantage. I've heard your objections. They're noted and dismissed. If you cannot accept the direction I'm taking this empire, you're welcome to retire from your position. Otherwise, I suggest you find a way to work within the new paradigm. Krell left without another word, but her expression promised this wasn't over. James waited until she was gone before speaking. That went well. She'll cause problems, but Krell's been causing problems since before I took the throne. This is just a new excuse. Zarieth glanced at him. How are you holding up? Resisting the urge to punch several ambassadors, mostly succeeding. Violence against diplomatic staff is discouraged, but I appreciate your restraint. She almost smiled. Come, there's someone I want you to meet. She led him through the crowds to where a younger Velkaron man stood alone, watching the chaos with an expression of barely contained amusement. He had the same long ears as Zarieth, but his were adorned with fewer rings and his armor was less ornate, functional rather than ceremonial. Commander Wraith, Zarieth said. My second in command. Wraith, this is James Keller. Wraith studied James with open curiosity rather than hostility. So you're the human who convinced our Empress that conquest might not be the answer to every problem. Impressive. Most people who question her end up decorating airlocks. I have that effect on people, apparently. Wraith extended his hand in the human gesture. He'd done his research. Welcome to the Empire, James Keller. You're either very brave or very stupid, and I haven't decided which yet. Probably both. I like him, Wraith told Zarieth. Can we keep him? That's the plan. She glanced around the hall, calculating. The summit will continue for 3 more days. You don't have to attend every session. But I should, James said. If I'm going to be your advisor, people need to see me actually advising. Need to understand I'm not just decorative. Wraith laughed. Decorative, that's good, though you're definitely causing decoration. Half the hall is still staring. Let them stare. Zarieth's hand found James's shoulder, a gesture of possession and protection both. they'll adjust. And if they don't, they'll learn that threatening what's mine has consequences. The 3 days that followed were a masterclass in political warfare. James attended sessions, offered input when appropriate, and slowly began to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that held the empire together. Some ambassadors warmed to him, saw potential in the policy changes. Others remained hostile but kept their distance because Zarieth's protection was absolute. There were 2 assassination attempts. The first was poison in his food, caught by the security detail Zarieth had insisted on. The second was more direct. A Crithian operative with a plasma blade who made it into his quarters before security intervened. James had handled that one himself, using hand-to-hand training from his military days, and the resulting injuries meant 3 days in the medical bay. Zarieth had been furious. Not at him, at the security failure, at the political faction that had ordered it, at the universe in general for making this so complicated. She'd sat beside his medical bed, her hand gripping his like she was afraid he'd disappear, and said quietly, "I can send you back. Earth is safer. I'm not leaving." "James, no." He squeezed her hand. "You told me there would be attempts. You were right, but I'm not running again, not from this, not from you." Something in her expression cracked. "You could have died." "But I didn't. I'm military trained and apparently harder to kill than expected. Plus I have you and you're terrifying when you're protective." He smiled. "I'm staying, Zarieth. However long this takes, however complicated it gets, I'm staying." She'd kissed him then, fierce and desperate and entirely unplanned, and James had kissed back and thought that maybe this was what coming home actually felt like. After the medical bay, after the assassination attempts, after Krell's faction had been quietly dismantled, and its members reassigned to positions where they could cause less damage, things stabilized. Not perfectly. Empires didn't change overnight, but enough that James could breathe without wondering if it would be his last. 6 months after returning to the Empire, he stood with Zarieth in her private quarters, looking out at the stars through windows that showed half the galaxy. They just finished another long day of negotiations and policy meetings, and James was learning that building something better was slower and harder than he'd imagined. "Do you regret it?" Zarieth asked quietly. "Coming back. Ask me on bad days and I'll say yes. Ask me right now," and he turned to face her. "No, I don't regret it. This is hard and complicated and sometimes I miss my tomatoes, but I don't regret choosing you. Your tomatoes. They were good tomatoes, Zarieth. Show some respect." She laughed, that genuine sound he'd worked so hard to earn. "We could grow tomatoes. I'll have agricultural specialists design optimal conditions. You could have an entire garden on the ship. You're offering me a garden to keep me happy. I'm offering whatever it takes: gardens, policy influence, a voice in how we shape this empire." She moved closer, her hand finding his face with familiar gentleness. "You changed me, James. Made me question everything I thought I knew about power and control and what strength actually means. The least I can do is give you tomatoes." James pulled her closer, and they stood like that for a while, 2 people from different worlds building something that didn't have a name in either of their languages. Empire and partnership and love and commitment all tangled together, complicated and messy and real. "I've been thinking," James said eventually, "about what we're building. It's not just policy changes. It's a completely different model. Empire as cooperation instead of conquest, strength through connection instead of fear. Your idealism showing again." "Yeah, but you like my idealism. You crossed galaxies for it." "I crossed galaxies for you. The idealism was just a bonus." But she was smiling. "What are you proposing?" "A new title. For what I am, not consort, not advisor, something that actually describes this." He gestured between them. "Partner, in all the ways that matter, building this together instead of you leading and me following." Zarieth was quiet for a long moment, then, "Partner, I like that, it's accurate." She kissed him, soft and certain. "Partners then. in politics and philosophy and whatever comes next. Even tomatoes, especially tomatoes, I'm told they're very important to you. They stayed there as the ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward the next system that needed negotiation, the next problem that needed solving, the next step in building an empire that actually deserved to exist. And in the private quarters they shared, surrounded by stars and possibility, James Keller and Empress Zarieth Velkaron built something that had never existed before. A partnership between conqueror and conscience, between power and compassion, between two people who'd found each other across impossible distances and refused to let go. The empire evolved, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. And at its heart stood two people who'd learned that sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones you choose, the ones you fight for, the ones that terrify you and complete you and remind you that being alive means being willing to change. Zarieth never stopped being an empress. James never stopped asking annoying questions. And somehow, impossibly, it worked.